The night I slapped a rich man's fiancée, I thought I was losing my job. I didn't know I was stepping into a war. The first thing I remember is the sound. Not my hand meeting Vanessa Hale's cheek. Not the gasp that swept across the dining room like a cold wind. It was the silence that came after. Sharp, sudden, complete. 1 second, Bella Rosa was alive with the soft clink of crystal, the low hum of expensive conversations, and the smooth piano drifting from the corner of the room. The next, it felt like the whole restaurant had stopped breathing. I stood there with my pulse hammering in my ears, my black apron damp with champagne, my right hand still tingling from what I had done. Across from me, Vanessa Hale stared in disbelief, one manicured hand pressed to her face, her blue eyes wide with outrage. She looked like the kind of woman who had never been told no a single day in her life. Tall, perfect hair, perfect white dress, perfect diamond the size of a small fortune blazing under the chandelier light. 5 seconds earlier, she had smiled at me like I was gum stuck to the bottom of her heel. Then she had tossed her champagne onto my uniform and told me, loud enough for half the room to hear, "Girls like you should be grateful you're allowed in places like this." I wish I could tell you I stayed calm, that I said something clever and walked away with my dignity intact. I didn't. I was exhausted, humiliated, and one rent payment away from having my electricity shut off. I was 24 years old, working doubles at one of the most expensive restaurants in Manhattan, carrying trays for people who spent more on one bottle of wine than I made in a week. My feet hurt. My back hurt. My pride hurt worst of all. So when her fingers brushed my chin like she was correcting a child, and she told me to smile when spoken to, something inside me snapped before my brain had a chance to stop it. And now the entire restaurant knew it. But the real reason the room had gone silent wasn't Vanessa. It was the man sitting beside her. Adrian Moretti. Even if you'd never seen his face in a paper or heard his name whispered in the city's darker corners, you would have known he was dangerous the second he looked up. He didn't have to shout. Men like Adrian never did. Power sat on him too naturally for that. He rose from his chair with slow, deliberate calm, the kind that made everyone else panic faster. He was taller than I had realized from across the room, broad-shouldered in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made around him, dark hair brushed neatly back, one hand still resting near the untouched glass of red wine at his place setting. His face gave away almost nothing. That was the frightening part. No outburst, no dramatic reaction, just those dark eyes, unreadable and steady, moving first to Vanessa, then to me. I wanted to speak. I wanted to apologize, to explain, to say that I wasn't a violent person, that I had never done anything like this in my life. But my throat felt tight, and every worst-case scenario crashed through my head at once. Fired, sued, blacklisted, maybe worse. Bella Rosa catered to politicians, hedge fund managers, celebrities, and people who never appeared on camera at all. Men who could erase your future with one phone call. And Adrian Moretti looked like the kind of man who never had to make the call twice. Vanessa turned toward him with a trembling little laugh, already slipping into the role of wounded victim. "Adrian," she said, her voice soft and shocked, "did you see what she just did?" I should have looked away. I should have lowered my eyes and accepted whatever was coming. Instead, I made the mistake of watching him. Because Adrian didn't reach for Vanessa. He didn't comfort her. He didn't even glance at the manager hurrying over with sweat shining on his forehead. He just studied her for one long second, then another, and something cold shifted in the air between them. That was when I realized the night was not about to end the way anyone in that restaurant expected. And when Adrian Moretti finally moved, every person in Bella Rosa leaned forward like they were about to witness a verdict. Adrian Moretti reached for Vanessa's left hand with the same calm precision a surgeon might use before making the first cut. No rush. No hesitation. Just absolute certainty. The diamond on her ring finger caught the chandelier light as he slid it free. In one smooth motion. For one strange second, nobody in Bella Rosa seemed to understand what they were seeing. Vanessa certainly did not. Her breath caught. Her lips parted. "Adrian," she said again, but this time her voice cracked around his name. He dropped the ring into her untouched wine glass. The tiny splash sounded louder than it should have in the frozen room. Then he looked at her and spoke in a tone so quiet the whole restaurant had to lean into the silence to hear it. "Leave." Vanessa stared at him as if he had switched languages mid-sentence. "What?" He did not repeat himself right away. That somehow made it worse. The manager, Mr. Kaplan, had arrived at my side by then, wringing his hands so hard his knuckles were pink. I could smell his aftershave, sharp and lemony, cutting through the scents of garlic butter and expensive perfume. "Mr. Moretti," he began, already sweating through the collar of his shirt, "I assure you, we will handle this. The waitress will be terminated immediately, and if there is anything else we can do to make this right tonight." Adrian lifted one hand without turning toward him. It was a small gesture, barely anything. But Mr. Kaplan shut his mouth so fast his teeth clicked. I had never seen a grown man silence another human being with 2 fingers and a glance. Vanessa's face had gone from pale to flushed. Her perfect composure was cracking around the edges now, and I could see the real panic underneath. "You are embarrassing me," she whispered, the words tight and furious. Adrian's expression did not change. "No," he said. "You embarrassed yourself." The words landed harder than a shout ever could have. A woman at table 12 actually put her hand over her chest. Somewhere near the bar, somebody dropped a fork. Vanessa looked around the room and seemed to realize, all at once, that every eye was on her. Not on me. On her. The heiress. The polished fiancée. The woman who had walked into Bellarosa like she owned the air in it. "She struck me," Vanessa said, louder now, desperate enough to think volume might save her. Adrian finally looked at me then. Not long. Just a brief, unreadable glance that moved over the damp front of my apron, the champagne dripping down black fabric, the red bloom of humiliation still burning. On my face. Something tightened in his jaw. When he turned back to Vanessa, his voice got even colder. "And before that, what did you do?" Vanessa laughed once, too high and too thin. "She is a waitress, Adrian. Do not do this here." "Exactly," he said. "She works here. You do not." I felt my knees weaken. I actually reached for the edge of the nearest tablecloth just to steady myself. None of this made sense. Men like Adrian Moretti did not publicly humiliate women from his own world over girls like me. They did not end engagements in dining rooms over a server in a $20 pair of non-slip shoes. They did not look at a woman carrying other people's dinner and act as if her dignity mattered. But that was exactly what he was doing. Vanessa must have realized she was losing control, because the softness dropped out of her face completely. "This is because of optics," she snapped. "Do not pretend this is moral outrage. You are doing this because people are watching." Adrian leaned slightly toward her, not enough to be intimate, just enough to make her step back. "No," he said again, and I would remember that word for a long time because of how final it sounded coming from him. "I am doing this because I told you once that cruelty in public is still cruelty. You clearly thought I was joking." Vanessa blinked. For the first time all night, she had no answer. Adrian stepped aside and motioned toward the entrance. 2 men in dark suits who had been seated near the back of the room rose instantly, as if they had been waiting for nothing but that gesture. They did not touch Vanessa. They did not need to. The path to the door opened on its own. People moved. Chairs shifted. Silence followed her like a second dress as she gathered what was left of her pride and walked out of Bellarosa without another word. The moment the front doors closed behind her, the whole room seemed to exhale. But I could not. I was still standing there in the wreckage of a night I no longer understood, my skin cold, my heart racing, my future hanging on the next thing Adrian Moretti decided to say to me. For 3 full seconds after Vanessa disappeared through the front doors, nobody moved. The chandeliers still glowed. The piano player still sat frozen with his hands hovering above the keys. Candlelight trembled in every wineglass like the room itself had a pulse, and it had just skipped a beat. Then the world came rushing back all at once. Conversations did not resume so much as stumble into existence. Chairs scraped softly against polished floors. Someone near the bar laughed too quickly, the brittle sound of a person trying to convince themselves they had not just witnessed the end of a society engagement in the middle of dinner service. I stood in the center of it all with champagne drying cold against my skin, every nerve in my body still waiting for the real consequence to arrive. It had to be coming. Men like Adrian Moretti did not change the course of an entire evening and then simply go back to their appetizers. He turned toward me slowly, and I forgot how to breathe. Up close, he looked even more impossible than he had from across the room. Not because he was handsome, though he was. It was the stillness, the control. Most powerful men I had served made a performance out of it. Louder voices, bigger gestures. Too much watch, too much cologne, too much ego. Adrian did not need any of that. His presence did the work for him. Dark eyes, perfectly fitted charcoal suit, a face that gave away almost nothing except the kind of disciplined patience that made everyone around him feel clumsy and overexposed. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that only I, Mr. Kaplan, and the nearest table could hear him clearly. Are you hurt? Of all the things I expected, that was not one of them. I blinked at him like he had asked me in another language. What? His gaze dipped to my face, then to the front of my apron, then back again. Are you hurt? The second time, the question landed. Not as a threat, as concern. Real or practiced, I could not tell, and that scared me in a completely different way. No, I said quickly. Too quickly. My voice sounded thin to my own ears. I am fine. Adrian watched me for a beat longer, and I had the terrible feeling he knew I was lying, at least a little. My cheek still stung. My pride was a mess. My hands would probably shake for the next 6 hours. But I was not about to admit any weakness in a room full of strangers who now knew my face. Mr. Kaplan found his voice beside me, though it came out smaller than usual. Chloe, go to the back and clean yourself up. Then, turning to Adrian with a smile so tight it barely qualified, he added, Sir, dessert will be complimentary this evening. Adrian did not even look at him. I am not staying. The manager swallowed. Of course. Adrian's eyes returned to me. What is your name? That should not have felt intimate. It was a basic question, the kind people ask every day. But coming from him, after everything that had just happened, it felt like stepping onto ice and hearing the first crack beneath your feet. Chloe, I said. Chloe Bennett. He repeated it once, quietly, like he was placing it somewhere in his memory. Miss Bennett. Nobody had called me that in years. Not with that kind of weight. Not with that kind of precision. You should not have been treated that way. My throat tightened before I could stop it. There are humiliations you can shrug off because they are expected. That is the ugly truth of service work in Manhattan. You learn to absorb certain tones, certain looks, certain comments delivered with a smile sharp enough to cut. You learn that wealthy people often confuse payment with permission. Permission to belittle. Permission to dismiss. Permission to remind you, in subtle ways, that your job is to carry what they order and disappear when they are done. What you do not learn is how to respond when someone powerful sees the insult and refuses to let it slide. I did not know where to put that kind of kindness, especially from a man like Adrian Moretti. So I reached for the only thing that made sense. Distance. I slapped your fiancé, I said, because apparently public humiliation had not cured me of honesty. One side of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Former fiancé. The word sent a fresh ripple through the nearest tables. He ignored it, and from what I saw, she earned it. I stared at him. Behind us, the piano started again, tentative and soft, like the musician was afraid any louder note might restart the entire disaster. A busser hurried past carrying a tray, eyes carefully lowered. Mr. Kaplan looked like he wanted to vanish into the wallpaper. And still Adrian stood there as if the entire restaurant belonged to him. Or maybe as if rooms just naturally reshaped themselves around men like him. Why? I asked before I could stop myself. His expression sharpened slightly. Why what? Why did you do that? My voice was steadier now, anchored by confusion instead of fear. Why would you end something like that here, over me? For the first time since he stood up, something flickered behind his eyes. Not softness. Not exactly. Recognition, maybe. As if I had asked the one question nobody else in the room would dare ask him. It was not over you, he said. It was over what she revealed about herself when she thought there would be no consequence. Then he glanced toward the door Vanessa had disappeared through, and when he looked back at me, his voice had gone quieter still. The timing was simply unfortunate. Unfortunate. That word almost made me laugh, except nothing about the night felt even remotely funny. My rent was still due in 4 days. I still had another 5 hours left in my shift. I still smelled like spilled champagne and stress. And somehow, in the middle of all of it, Adrian Moretti had looked at me not like furniture, not like staff, but like a person standing at the center of a problem he had decided was his to address. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made the air feel thinner, because I had the strange, sinking feeling that this was not the end of our conversation. It was the beginning. Adrian left Bella Rosa without another word, and somehow that was worse than if he had stayed. If he had threatened me, I would have known what to do with it. If he had offered me money, I could have hated him for it. If he had smiled like this was some game powerful men played when they got bored, I could have filed him away with every other wealthy customer who treated the rest of us like scenery. But he did none of those things. He simply nodded once, as if our conversation had settled something inside him, then turned and walked toward the front doors with the quiet certainty of a man who expected the world to clear a path. And it did. Every head tracked him. Every voice lowered. Even the doorman seemed to straighten before pulling the heavy glass open for him. The moment Adrian Moretti stepped out onto 52nd Street, Bella Rosa changed. Not back to normal. There was no normal left to go back to. The room buzzed with the kind of tension that sticks to the walls after something expensive breaks. I stood there for one extra second, maybe two, staring at the door he had just passed through like I might still wake up and find out none of it had happened. Then Mr. Kaplan grabbed my elbow. Not hard. Just urgently. Back. Now. His voice came out in a whisper so tight it sounded painful. I let him steer me toward the service hall because my legs still felt unreliable, like I had borrowed them from someone else, and they might give out at any second. The moment the kitchen door swung shut behind us, the noise hit me full force. Plates clattering, orders being shouted, the hiss of burners, the scent of garlic, butter, basil, and hot steel filling the air until it felt impossible that the world had almost stopped 5 minutes earlier in the dining room. But the people in the kitchen knew. Of course they knew. News traveled through a restaurant faster than fire through dry paper. Every line cook, every busser, every server who passed me gave me the same look. Shock first. Curiosity second. Fear last. It was the fear that made my stomach knot. Office, Mr. Kaplan said, already marching ahead. I followed him past the pantry and the dry storage room, my damp shoes squeaking lightly against the tile. The closer we got to his office, the harder my heart pounded. I had been written up once for arriving 7 minutes late during a subway delay. Kaplan believed in rules the way priests believed in confession. I could not imagine what category he would file this night under. He shut the office door behind us and turned so fast I nearly stepped back. What were you thinking? He hissed. There it was. The consequence. Familiar. Sharp. Easier to understand than Adrian's calm had been. She threw champagne at me, I said, because apparently my survival instinct had taken the night off. Do not get smart with me, Chloe. He yanked off his glasses, pinched the bridge of his nose, then put them back on with visibly shaking fingers. Do you have any idea who these people are? Apparently not, I said. The answer slipped out before I could soften it. Kaplan stared at me in disbelief, then started pacing the 6 feet between his desk and filing cabinet like a man wearing a groove into the carpet. His office always smelled like burnt coffee and old printer paper. Tonight it smelled like panic. You embarrassed one of the most connected women in this city in a room full of witnesses, he said. You put your hands on a guest. You caused a scene during prime dinner service. And somehow, by some miracle I am not yet ready to question, Adrian Moretti walked out without demanding my liquor license, my building, and possibly my soul. I folded my arms across my chest, more to keep from shaking than out of defiance. So I am fired. He stopped pacing. I did not say that. I blinked. You dragged me in here like I was about to be executed. Do not be dramatic. I work in Manhattan service. Drama is part of the uniform. For one strange second, his mouth twitched. It disappeared so fast I might have imagined it. Then his face hardened again. You are not fired tonight. Tonight. The word caught my attention immediately. Not fired tonight meant tomorrow was still available for ruin. Why not? I asked carefully. Kaplan gave me a look usually reserved for people who asked whether fire was hot. Because 5 minutes ago, Adrian Moretti left a message with the hostess on his way out. A cold ripple slid down my spine. What message? Mr. Kaplan sat behind his desk, suddenly looking older than he had an hour earlier. He said, and I quote, Miss Bennett keeps her job. If anyone here decides otherwise, they can explain it to me personally. The room went still around me. I could hear the muffled crash of pans from the kitchen, the buzz of an overhead light, the faint pulse in my own ears. That is ridiculous, I said, because it was. It absolutely was. He does not know me. That has not stopped him from making himself very clear. Kaplan leaned back in his chair and studied me with a new expression, one I had never seen on his face before. Not annoyance, not managerial concern, calculation. Tell me exactly what happened before he stood up. You were there. I saw the end. I want the beginning. So I told him. Not every humiliating detail, but enough. Vanessa's tone. The champagne. The words. The way her fingers had brushed my chin like I was a thing to be arranged instead of a person to be spoken to. Kaplan listened without interrupting, which was so unusual it almost unsettled me more than the story itself. When I finished, he let out a long breath and tapped his pen once against the desk. You are off the floor for the rest of the night, he said. Go clean up. Lena can cover your section. Relief and dread hit me at the same time. And tomorrow? His gaze sharpened. Tomorrow you show up on time. Keep your head down, and pray Ms. Hale decides she has more dignity than revenge. I almost laughed at that. Almost. Because deep down, I already knew women like Vanessa Hale did not walk away from public humiliation and discover humility overnight. They made phone calls. They moved pieces. They smiled while they ruined you. And for reasons I could not begin to understand, Adrian Moretti had just stepped between her and me. That should have made me feel safe. Instead, as I stood in Mr. Kaplan's tiny office with dried champagne stiffening my apron and his warning echoing in my ears, all I could think was that men like Adrian never entered a life quietly. They entered like weather. And sooner or later, weather always arrived with a price. The employee bathroom at Bella Rosa was barely bigger than a walk-in closet, but that night it felt like the only place in Manhattan where I could breathe without being watched. I locked the door behind me, set both hands on the edge of the sink, and stared at my reflection under the harsh fluorescent light. I looked exactly how I felt. Tired, pale, unsteady around the edges. My dark blonde hair, which I had pinned back so carefully before my shift, had started slipping loose around my face. My apron was stained down the front, the champagne leaving a sticky map across black fabric. There was a faint pink mark high on my cheek, not dramatic enough for sympathy, just enough to remind me that humiliation could leave fingerprints even when no one meant it to. I reached for a paper towel, dampened it under cold water, and began blotting at the mess on my apron like that might somehow erase the entire evening with it. It did not. Nothing could. Not the water. Not the cheap soap from the dispenser. Not the deep breaths I kept trying to take and failing to finish. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ring drop into the wine glass. I heard Adrian's voice saying, "Leave," in that low, final tone. I heard Kaplan repeating the message like it was a bomb he had been forced to carry in both hands. Miss Bennett keeps her job. If anyone here decides otherwise, they can explain it to me personally. The words should have made me feel protected. Instead, they made me feel marked. That was the problem with help from powerful men. It never arrived quietly. It arrived with witnesses, with consequences, with everybody in the room suddenly seeing you as something other than yourself. I was still scrubbing at the stain when someone knocked gently on the door. Chloe, Lena's voice. Soft, cautious. It is me. I unlocked the door, and she slipped inside before anyone in the hallway could see. Lena had worked at Bella Rosa 2 years longer than I had. She was 30, quick with customers, sharper with managers, and one of the only people in the building who never made me feel like I was one mistake away from becoming disposable. Tonight her dark curls were twisted into a neat bun, but a few strands had escaped near her temples from rushing between tables. She took one look at me and let out a long breath. I was afraid you had climbed out the bathroom window. We do not have a bathroom window. Details. She leaned against the door and folded her arms. Do you want the good news first or the terrifying gossip? I gave a weak laugh before I could stop it. It felt strange in my throat, like my body had forgotten how to make the sound. At this point, surprise me. Good news. Table 20 asked specifically for you to keep their dessert recommendations because, and I quote, they trust your taste after seeing your courage. I stared at her. That cannot be real. It is Manhattan. Rich people love drama as long as it happens to someone else. Her expression softened. Terrifying gossip. Half the dining room thinks Adrian Moretti has been secretly in love with you for years. I actually dropped the paper towel into the sink. Lena, I know. She held up both hands. It is absurd, which is why people are enjoying it so much. I leaned back against the counter and closed my eyes for 1 second. I do not even know him. That has not stopped the hostess from saying he looked at you like a man making a life decision. The hostess reads too many romance novels. That has also not stopped her. I opened my eyes and looked at Lena in the mirror. Tell me honestly, how bad is it out there? Her face shifted, humor giving way to something more careful. Bad enough that everyone is pretending not to stare when your name comes up. Worse enough that the regulars are whispering. Strange enough that Kaplan told the kitchen nobody is allowed to discuss you where guests can hear. She paused. And complicated enough that Vanessa Hale's assistant called 10 minutes ago. My stomach dropped so fast it felt physical. What did she say? Nothing directly to you. She asked whether Bellarosa intended to maintain standards after tonight. I let out a slow breath through my nose. That sounds like a threat in a pearl necklace. Exactly. Lena stepped closer. Chloe, listen to me. If she wants to make trouble, she can. Women like that do not need to raise their voices. They just make things smaller around you until there is nowhere left to stand. I knew she was right because I had seen versions of it before. Not at this level, maybe, but enough to recognize the shape. Wealth had a polite way of ruining people. It sent emails. It canceled bookings. It placed calls behind closed doors, and then smiled in public like everything was perfectly civilized. I stared down at the wet sink, my own reflection broken in the mirror by fluorescent glare. I should never have hit her. The words came out quieter than I meant them to. Honest. Tired. Lena was silent for a moment. Maybe not, she said finally. But she should never have touched you like that either. I swallowed hard. That does not change what comes next. No, she reached over and adjusted the edge of my collar the way an older sister might. But maybe it changes who is standing where when it does. I knew who she meant without her saying his name. That was the trouble. Adrian was now part of the equation whether I wanted him there or not. A man I had known for less than 10 minutes had altered the balance of my life with one sentence on his way out the door. I do not want his protection, I said, though the words lacked conviction. Lena watched me carefully. Then let me give you some free advice as someone who grew up around men with too much money and too little patience. Wanting it has nothing to do with whether it is already in motion. A chill moved through me that had nothing to do with the damp apron clinging to my skin. You are making him sound dangerous. I am making him sound powerful. There is a difference. Most of the time. She stepped back toward the door, then hesitated with her hand on the knob. By the way, there is one more thing. Please tell me it is not worse. Her mouth twisted. Depends how you feel about town cars. I frowned. What town car? The black one parked across the street for the last 12 minutes. My pulse kicked once, hard enough to make me grip the sink again. What? Tinted windows. Driver up front. Not moving. The valet says it arrived 3 minutes after Mr. Moretti left and has not gone anywhere since. She studied my face and lowered her voice. Chloe, if that car is there when your shift ends, do not walk home alone. The room seemed to tilt very slightly beneath my feet. Outside the bathroom door, the dinner rush went on. Orders called. Plates moved. Glassware clinked. Normal life, stubborn and loud. But inside that tiny room, with cold water drying on my hands and Lena's warning hanging in the air between us, I felt something settle deep in my chest that looked a lot like certainty. Adrian Moretti might have left Bellarosa. Whatever he had set in motion had not. For the rest of the shift, I worked like someone walking across thin ice. Carefully, quietly, listening for cracks that had not happened yet, but felt inevitable all the same. Kaplan kept me off the main floor, which should have felt like mercy. Instead, it felt like exile with an audience. I polished silverware in the service station, folded linen napkins with hands that had finally stopped shaking, and tried not to notice how often people found reasons to pass by without actually needing anything. Servers slowed down near me. Bussers asked questions they already knew the answers to. Even the pastry chef, who usually spoke in sighs and sarcasm, paused long enough to look me over and mutter, "You look too normal for someone who detonated the dining room." By 11:30, the worst of the rush had passed. Bellarosa was settling into that expensive, late-night softness rich people seem to love. When the lights dimmed a fraction lower, the piano leaned into slower songs, and dessert menus appeared like invitations to pretend tomorrow did not exist. Mine very much did. Tomorrow had bills in it. Tomorrow had subway fare. A landlord who believed grace period was a myth invented by irresponsible people, and a morning class I had already considered skipping twice this semester because exhaustion had started to feel permanent. Whatever strange force Adrian Moretti had thrown around me tonight did not change any of that. It just made my problems harder to recognize. At 1:45 to midnight, Lena found me near the espresso machine with 2 paper cups in her hands. "Drink this before you turn into a ghost," she said, passing one over. I took a sip and nearly cried from gratitude. Strong. Bitter. Too hot. Perfect. "Is the car still there?" I asked before I could stop myself. Lena's expression said she had been expecting that question. Yes. The single word sat between us heavier than it should have. I wrapped both hands around the cup, more for the warmth than the coffee. Maybe it belongs to another customer. Maybe. She leaned one hip against the counter. And maybe hedge fund managers shop at thrift stores. I exhaled through my nose. "You are not helping." "I am not trying to help. I am trying to keep you from doing the thing I can see you planning." "What thing?" "The thing where you leave through the side exit and tell yourself walking 3 blocks to the subway alone at midnight is completely fine because you are too stubborn to let anyone think you are scared." I looked at her over the rim of my cup. "I hate how well you know me. It is one of my best qualities." She took a careful sip of her coffee, then lowered her voice. "Kaplan asked Vincent the valet to check the plates. That got my attention fast. And Vincent came back looking like he wanted to update his will." A cold knot formed low in my stomach. "Lena, I know." She glanced toward the hallway, making sure no one was close enough to overhear. "The car is registered to a shell company, which means nothing by itself. Except Vincent says he has seen the same driver outside a private fundraiser in Tribeca and a courthouse downtown, and once outside a hotel where half the city's political donors suddenly remembered they had other plans." I stared at her. "That is absurdly specific. Valets notice everything. It is how they survive." I set my coffee down because my fingers had gone tight around the cup. "So what are you saying?" "I am saying the man outside is not waiting for tiramisu." That should not have sent a rush of heat through me, but it did. Not the flattering kind. The dangerous kind. The kind that came when your life stopped feeling random and started feeling chosen by forces too large for you to argue with. I thought of Adrian's face in the dining room. The way he had looked at Vanessa, then at me. The message he left behind. The quiet certainty in every word he spoke. "He does not know me," I said again, softer this time, like repetition might make it true in a way it clearly was not anymore. Lena tipped her head. "Maybe not. But he knows something about what happened tonight, and men like that do not separate principle from possession very neatly." I bristled at that. "I am not something to be possessed." "I know that. You know that. The question is whether he knows that." Before I could answer, Kaplan appeared at the end of the station, looking more put together than he had an hour earlier, and somehow more nervous because of it. His tie was straight again. His hair was smoothed down. His expression had returned to managerial calm, which meant trouble had simply changed outfits. "Chloe," he said. "Front foyer. Now." Lena and I exchanged a look. "Why?" I asked. Kaplan gave me the kind of flat stare that suggested my interest in self-preservation was becoming personally insulting. "Because a gentleman is asking for you." I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. "A gentleman? That is the word I chose in place of several others," he said. "Do not make me repeat myself." Every instinct I had told me not to go. Or maybe more accurately, every instinct told me that once I did, the night would divide into before and after in a way I might not be able to undo. Still, I put down the coffee and followed him through the service hall. The closer we got to the front of the restaurant, the louder my pulse became. We passed the hostess stand, now half-lit and quiet, the last reservations of the night long since seated. The front windows looked out onto 52nd Street, black and shining from an earlier rain. And there it was, parked at the curb beneath the amber streetlights. Long black. Silent. The town car looked less like transportation and more like a statement someone had polished. A driver stood beside the rear passenger door in a dark overcoat, hands clasped in front of him, posture straight enough to qualify as military or expensive training. He did not glance around. He did not fidget. He simply waited. Kaplan stopped 2 feet from the entrance and lowered his voice. "He says Mr. Moretti would like a word." I turned to him slowly. "Would like." I am choosing optimism again. My mouth went dry. Outside, the driver opened the rear door of the car with smooth, practiced precision. I could not see inside. Just darkness. Leather, maybe. Shadow. The shape of a man seated somewhere beyond the tinted glass and city reflections. Waiting. For me. And standing there in Belarus's foyer with the scent of coffee still on my hands and midnight pressing cold against the windows, I understood something that should have scared me more than it did. Adrian Moretti had not sent a car to make sure I got home. He had sent one because whatever came next, he intended to tell me himself. The cold hit first. Manhattan after midnight always carried a different kind of chill, the kind that slid under your coat and settled into your bones like the city itself was reminding you how small you were. I stood just inside Bellaros's front doors with Kaplan a step behind me and stared at the open rear door of the town car like it might swallow me whole if I got too close. The driver did not speak. He did not gesture. He just waited with that unnerving stillness men have when they are used to being obeyed. I should have said no. I knew that immediately. I should have thanked Kaplan for the warning, called Lena, taken the train home with my head down, and convinced myself the night could still shrink back into something survivable. Instead, I heard my own voice ask the question before I had decided whether I wanted the answer. Why? Kaplan did not pretend not to understand. Because men like Mr. Moretti do not send cars for casual conversation. Not exactly comforting. I stepped outside. My non-slip shoes clicked against the wet sidewalk, each sound too loud in the hush of the late hour. The city around us kept moving, indifferent and bright. Taxis flashed by in ribbons of yellow. Steam rose from a street great farther down the block. Somewhere a siren wailed, distant and ordinary. But right there at the curb, everything felt suspended. Like the block itself knew better than to interrupt whatever was about to happen. I stopped beside the open door and looked in. Adrian sat on the far side of the back seat, one arm resting along the dark leather, the low interior light tracing the line of his jaw and the edge of his white shirt collar beneath a black wool coat. No tie now. No dining room around him. No crowd to manage his expression for. Somehow that made him more dangerous, not less. More human too, which was worse. Human men could be read. This one still felt carved out of control and shadow. "Miss Bennet," he said. His voice carried through the open door warm enough to contrast with the air and cool enough to keep its distance. "Please." I stayed where I was. "You sent a car." One side of his mouth moved, not quite amusement, not quite apology. "You noticed." That is one word for it. His eyes held mine for a second, then another. "You were not going to accept if I sent a message." He was probably right, which irritated me on principle. "And you thought this would go over better?" "No," he said calmly. "I thought this would get you to the part where I explain myself." A laugh almost escaped me. Not because anything was funny. Because exhaustion had pushed me past the point where good judgment and disbelief could still be neatly separated. "That assumes I want an explanation." "You do." The certainty in his tone made me bristle. "You do not know me." "No," he said. "But I know what tonight looked like from where I was sitting. You have every reason not to trust my timing." That stopped me for half a beat because it was more honest than I expected. Most powerful men avoided honesty unless it benefited them. Adrian seemed to place it carefully, like a tool he only used when he meant to cut directly through nonsense. The driver still stood by the door without moving a muscle. Behind me, through Bellaros's glass entry, I could feel Kaplan pretending not to watch. I crossed my arms against the cold, then explained from there. Adrian was silent for a moment, not stalling, choosing. "Vanessa Hale is not a woman accustomed to consequence," he said at last. "That has been clear for longer than tonight. Yet you were going to marry her." His gaze sharpened slightly, not with anger but with recognition. Business arrangements are often clearer on paper than they are in practice. I frowned. "That sounds like a very polished way of saying you were engaged for the wrong reasons." "It sounds," he said, "like I am not in the habit of discussing personal failures on a public sidewalk." I should have backed off. Instead, I found myself stepping closer to the door, as if proximity might make the whole situation easier to understand. It did not. If anything, it made the inside of the car feel more intimate than I wanted it to. The faint scent of cedar and clean leather drifted out. Adrian's eyes did not leave my face. "I am not getting in," I said. "I did not ask you to." That gave me pause. "Then why am I out here?" "Because if I came inside again, your manager would stop breathing altogether." That surprised a small, unwilling laugh out of me. Real this time. Brief, startled, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Adrian watched it happen with an expression I could not quite read. Softer, maybe. Or maybe simply less. Armored for 1 second than before. "There it is," he said quietly. "What?" "The part of you that still knows tonight was absurd." I looked away toward the street because meeting his eyes while he said things like that felt unwise. Absurd is one word for it. You are angry. You sent a car after I got publicly humiliated, watched my boss panic, and spent 2 hours waiting to find out whether a woman with a trust fund is about to dismantle my life because I finally had one bad minute. So yes, I am a little angry. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I did not take them back. Adrian nodded once as if anger, at least, was a language he respected. Good, he said. You should be. I stared at him. That is not the part people usually say. Most people prefer gratitude because it keeps the balance comfortable. His gaze moved briefly to the restaurant behind me, then back. I am not asking you to be grateful, Chloe. It was the first time he had used my first name without the shield of Miss Bennet, and the sound of it in his voice did something quiet and unwelcome to my pulse. I ignored that completely. Then what are you asking? He leaned back slightly, his face settling into that same dangerous calm I was beginning to realize meant a hard truth was coming. I am asking you to listen very carefully. Vanessa will not let tonight go. Public embarrassment is the one currency people like her never accept at face value. She will smile. She will call this a misunderstanding. And then she will start reducing your options one polite step at a time. A shiver moved through me that had nothing to do with the wind. Because he was saying exactly what Lena had said, only colder. More certain. You sound very sure. I am. Because you know her that well? Because I know how power behaves when it feels insulted. The city noise seemed to dim for a second, or maybe it was just the way his voice narrowed my attention until the whole block blurred around it. I looked at the open door, the driver, the man inside the car who had just detonated his own engagement, and now sat there warning me like the fallout belonged to him too. And what exactly am I supposed to do with that information? Adrian held my gaze for one long, unreadable second. Then he said, For tonight, you are supposed to let me take you home. Because the first thing people do after losing control in public is send someone else to recover it in private. I should tell you I said no immediately. That I kept my chin up, thanked Adrian Moretti for the warning, and took the subway home like a normal person determined not to be absorbed into a stranger's orbit. I did not. I stood there on the wet Manhattan sidewalk with cold air pressing through my coat, and his words settling under my skin in all the places fear already lived. The first thing people do after losing control in public is send someone else to recover it in private. I hated how plausible that sounded. I hated even more that a part of me had been thinking the same thing ever since Lena told me about the car. You make everything sound dramatic, I said, because if I admitted he was right, then I would also have to admit that the night had shifted into something I could no longer manage alone. Adrian's expression did not change. No, I make it sound likely. The distinction landed harder than I wanted it to. Behind me, Bella Rosa glowed warm and gold through the glass, all polished light and expensive calm, like the restaurant had already edited the evening into a story rich people would tell each other later with lowered voices and delighted outrage. Out here, the city felt colder, more honest. Steam rose from a grate halfway down the block. Headlights washed across the slick pavement in slow ribbons. Somewhere a couple laughed too loudly as they passed, drunk on money or martinis or both. None of it touched the strange stillness gathered around the open car door. I looked from Adrian to the driver and back again. If I get in that car, I am not agreeing to anything. I know. I am not asking for help. I know that too. And if this is some kind of guilt-driven apology tour because your former fiancée humiliated a waitress in front of your investment friends, I am really not in the mood. Something almost like approval flickered in his eyes. Then it is fortunate that I am not driven by guilt. That is not as reassuring as you think it is. For the first time, he looked genuinely amused. Faintly, briefly, the expression altered his whole face in a way that was frankly inconvenient. Chloe, he said, and there was no force in it, no command, just a calm steadiness that somehow asked for more attention than shouting ever could have. If I wanted obedience, this conversation would sound very different. I stared at him. That sounds worse. Honesty often does it first. I should have walked away then. I had every reason to. Instead, I found myself stepping closer and leaning just enough to see more of the back seat. Dark leather, clean lines, a folded newspaper beside him, no visible threat, which, somehow, made the entire thing more unsettling. Dangerous people in movies announce themselves with obvious menace. Real power arrived polished and quiet and perfectly certain it would be accommodated. How do you even know where I live? I asked. Adrian's gaze held mine. I do not. That surprised me. Then how are you planning to take me home? By asking. A beat passed. And if you prefer, by taking you to a police precinct instead, though I suspect that would create complications neither of us wants. He was right about that too. I had no interest in trying to explain the night to an officer who would hear Bella Rosa, Vanessa Hale, and Adrian Moretti in the same sentence, and immediately decide the waitress was the least important part of the story. I hate that you have an answer for everything. No, he said quietly. You hate that I anticipated your objections. That was true enough to annoy me all over again. I crossed my arms tighter against the cold. You are very confident for a man sitting in a car outside a restaurant after ending his engagement in public. The amusement disappeared. Not fully, but enough to reveal something more serious underneath. Confidence and comfort are not the same thing. I did not know what to do with that. It sounded too human, too unguarded. Like a corner of the truth had slipped out before he could decide whether I had earned it. The city moved around us in flashes and reflections. A taxi slowed at the light. A delivery truck rumbled somewhere farther down the avenue. The driver remained perfectly still at the door, which I was starting to find almost impressive. Suppose I believe you, I said at last. Suppose I believe Vanessa might try something stupid because tonight did not go her way. Why do you care what happens after that? Adrian did not answer immediately. He looked past me, just briefly, toward the restaurant windows where my reflection hovered pale and small against the glass. When he spoke, his voice had dropped low enough that I had to lean in to catch it over the city noise. Because I watched a room full of wealthy people decide your dignity was optional until it inconvenienced them. His eyes came back to mine. And because I dislike cowardice dressed as manners. The words landed somewhere deeper than they should have. For one disorienting second, I saw the evening from his side of the room. Vanessa smiling as she humiliated me. Guests pretending not to notice because discomfort was easier to outsource when someone in an apron was carrying it. Adrian sitting there, silent until he was not. It did not make him easier to trust, but it did make him easier to understand, which was, in its own way, far more dangerous. That still does not explain the car, I said softer now. No, he agreed. It explains why I stayed long enough to send it. We held each other's gaze for a second too long. I hated the awareness that kept slipping into the spaces between words. Not romance. Not yet. Something more unstable than that. Recognition, maybe. The unsettling sense of having encountered a person who could tilt the axis of your life simply by noticing where it had already been off balance. My apartment is on the east side, I said finally, and the moment the address left my mouth, I felt like I had crossed an invisible line. Adrian nodded once to the driver, who stepped back without comment. Thank you, Adrian said, and somehow those two words carried none of the triumph I expected. Only acknowledgement. Space. The fact that I still had a choice, even if both of us knew the choice had already been made. I looked down the block once, toward the subway entrance glowing green in the distance. Then back at the car. Back at him. My life, as of this morning, had consisted of overdue bills, morning classes, double shifts, and a fragile determination not to need anybody. My life, as of midnight, stood open before me in black paint and tinted glass. I took a breath that tasted like rain and city exhaust and trouble. Then I got into Adrian Moretti's car. The door closed with a soft, expensive sound that somehow felt louder than the traffic outside. 1 second I was standing on the sidewalk with rain in the air and restaurant light on my back. The next, I was inside a world built to make ordinary people lower their voices. The leather seats were dark and smooth, the kind that probably never cracked, never stained, never belonged to anyone who worried about replacing them. The city outside turned into a moving blur behind tinted glass. Yellow cabs flashed past. Streetlights slid across Adrian's face in bands of gold and shadow. The partition remained open, but the driver never looked back. That alone told me enough. Men like Adrian did not need privacy requested. They existed inside it automatically. I sat as far from him as the seat allowed and folded my hands in my lap so he would not see that they were trembling again. This does not mean I trust you, I said as the car pulled away from the curb. Adrian adjusted one cuff with unhurried precision, then looked at me. That would be a strange decision on your part. I hated that answer because it was sensible. I hated even more that he seemed determined not to take advantage of the situation by pretending to be offended. The car turned east, gliding through midnight traffic with the kind of smooth control that made my own life feel louder by comparison. My subway rides smelled like damp wool, brake dust, and somebody else's takeout. This car smelled like cedar, clean leather, and silence. You really do not do anything halfway, do you? I asked. No, Adrian said. It usually creates more work later. I looked at him. That sounds less like a personality trait and more like a threat. His eyes flickered with something almost thoughtful. It is a habit. Streetlight washed over him again, and for the first time since Bellarosa, I noticed the faint strain beneath all that composure. Not weakness, just fatigue, maybe. The kind that came from holding too much in place for too long. His collar was open now, one button undone at the throat. His coat lay smooth against broad shoulders that still looked too prepared for impact, even sitting still. So, I said, because silence with him felt too active to leave alone. Do you usually pick up waitresses after ending engagements? Or is tonight a special event? That earned me the smallest shift in expression. Not a smile. Not exactly. But enough to tell me he heard the blade under the question and respected the edge of it. Tonight is unusually inefficient, he said. That is one way to describe it. What would you call it? I turned toward the window before answering, watching Manhattan pass by in reflections and neon. A couple stood under a deli awning arguing softly over a phone. A bike messenger cut between cabs like he had been born without fear. Somewhere above us, office lights still burned in high-rise windows because this city never really slept. It just changed costumes after dark. I would call it the worst shift of my life, I said. And I have worked Valentine's Day with 3 broken espresso machines. That did it. Adrian actually smiled then, faint and brief, but real enough to transform his face in a way that made me immediately suspicious of my own nervous system. That sounds catastrophic. It was worse than tonight. Tonight included champagne, public humiliation, a broken engagement, a mystery car, and an invitation that sounded one polite word away from an order. I looked back at him. So yes, slightly worse. The smile faded, but the warmth of it lingered in his eyes for a moment longer than I expected. It was not an order. You keep saying things like that as if I should find them comforting. I say them because they are true. The car stopped at a red light. Outside, a food cart vendor was packing up foil trays beneath the glow of a street lamp. Steam curled into the dark. Somewhere down the block, music leaked from an open bar door, bass low and distant. Ordinary city sounds. Ordinary people finishing ordinary nights. I suddenly missed ordinary with an ache that surprised me. What happens tomorrow? I asked quietly. Adrian did not answer right away. That depends on Vanessa. You keep talking about her like she is a weather system. Some storms wear perfume. I let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, almost not. That is dramatic. Accurate. He leaned back slightly, eyes on me now with that same still concentration that made everything feel more serious than I wanted it to. Tomorrow she will decide whether preserving her image matters more than punishing you for damaging it. If she is wise, she will choose distance. And if she is not, then she will make calls. I swallowed. To get me fired. Possibly. That sounded too easy. Because employment is rarely the first pressure point people with her resources reach for. The knot in my stomach tightened. What else is there? Adrian's gaze moved briefly to my hands folded in my lap. Rent. School. References. Transportation. The illusion that bad luck is random. I turned to face him fully then because hearing the structure of my life spoken out loud by a man I barely knew felt like a line being crossed, even if he had not raised his voice to do it. How do you know I am in school? His expression did not change, but something in the air did. Not guilt. Recognition. I did not know, he said. That was inference. From what? Your schedule. He glanced at my coat sleeve, the faint ink stain near the cuff from the pen that had exploded in my bag 2 days ago. The textbooks sticking out of your tote when you came outside. The fact that your exhaustion looks temporary rather than defeated. I stared at him. Nobody had ever described my life like that. Temporary rather than defeated. The words caught somewhere inside me and stayed there. That is an unsettling thing to notice about a stranger. I notice many unsettling things. Do you ever hear yourself? Constantly. The light changed. The car moved forward. We rode in silence for half a block, then another. Not empty silence this time. Waited. Thinking silence. The kind that gathered between two people who had stopped pretending the conversation was casual. I looked down at my shoes, at the scuffed black non-slips I had bought on clearance, because practical mattered more than pretty when you were on your feet 10 hours at a time. They looked ridiculous against the polished floor of his car. Everything about me did. The damp hem of my coat. The discount tights under my uniform skirt. The fact that I was carrying tomorrow's lecture notes in a bag that had a broken zipper. I became suddenly, painfully aware of the difference between us. Not just money. Structure. Certainty. Adrian lived in a world where people opened doors before he reached them. I lived in one where I counted grocery totals in my head before I reached the register. You should stop looking at your shoes like they offended you, he said. My head snapped up. I was not. You were. You are very observant. It is exhausting. It can be. Then here is an observation for you. I lifted my chin. I do not belong in this car. Adrian held my gaze. For the first time since I got in, his answer came without any trace of irony or distance. Neither do most of the people who ride in it. That was not what I expected. What is that supposed to mean? The city lights moved across his face again, catching in his eyes before sliding away. It means money often buys access before it buys character. He looked out the window for one brief second, then back at me. You are measuring worth by the wrong metric, Chloe. My name in his voice did that same inconvenient thing to my pulse again. I ignored it on purpose and looked away, because the only alternative was admitting that somewhere between Bellarosa and the East Side, the man I had written off as dangerous was becoming something worse. Complicated. And complicated, I was starting to learn, was far harder to resist than simple fear. By the time the car turned onto my block, it was past 12:30 and the city had gone from glamorous to honest. The East Side where I lived was not the polished version tourists photographed. It was narrower than that. Quieter. A row of aging brick buildings with chipped stoops, flickering entry lights, and window air conditioners that rattled like old men clearing their throats in summer. In winter, the pipes knocked. In rain, the gutters overflowed. In every season, rent was too high for what you got. The town car slowed to the curb in front of my building, and for a second I forgot to move. I was too aware of the contrast. Adrian's car idled in a pool of soft streetlight, sleek and silent, while my apartment building stood above it with rust on the fire escape and a handwritten notice taped crookedly inside. The front door reminding tenants that late fees would be enforced beginning on the 5th. The sight of it grounded me faster than anything else could have. This was my real life. Not black cars. Not dangerous men with perfect posture and unreadable eyes. Laundry folded on the back of a chair because I did not own a dryer. A sink that dripped unless you hit the pipe underneath. Instant oatmeal, overdue utility bills, and lecture notes spread across a second-hand table with one short leg. I reached for the door handle. Thank you, I said, because manners survived even when reason was struggling. You do not need to walk me up. Adrian did not move. I know. That answer should not have made me pause, but it did. I looked at him. Then why do I feel like you are about to argue with me? Because you are observant when you are tired. I let out a breath that was almost a laugh and shook my head. I am not inviting you upstairs. I did not ask. Good. Chloe. Something in the way he said my name made my hand stop on the handle. Not because it was soft. It was not. Adrian did not seem built for softness. But it was careful, and I was beginning to realize careful from him often meant serious. I turned back. The streetlight outside caught one side of his face, leaving the other in shadow. What? He was silent for half a beat, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the last trace of dry humor. Tomorrow, if anything changes, you call this number. He pulled a card from the inside pocket of his coat and held it out to me. Thick paper. Matte black. No title. No company. Just a number embossed in silver, and his last name beneath it like that alone should explain everything. I stared at it without taking it. You carry cards with just your phone number? Only for unusual evenings. This counts as unusual? By a narrow margin. I took the card because refusing it would have felt more dramatic than accepting it. The paper was heavier than any business card had a right to be. Like it had opinions about itself. I turned it over. Blank on the back. What exactly am I calling for? I asked. If your manager changes his mind. If your landlord receives a sudden complaint. If your school schedule becomes unexpectedly complicated. If you notice the same car twice. If something feels wrong and you are tempted to dismiss it because explaining it sounds embarrassing. I looked up sharply. That is a very specific list. It is meant to be useful. It is meant to be invasive. Adrian did not argue. Perhaps, but not inaccurate. I should have been offended. Part of me was. The larger part was stuck on the fact that he had just named my fears in the order they would likely arrive. Job first. Housing second. School third. He understood pressure the way other people understood weather patterns. You really think she would go that far? I asked quietly. Adrian's gaze held mine with that same unsettling steadiness I had started to associate with unpleasant truth. I think wounded pride behaves irrationally when it has resources. That is not an answer. It is the one I trust. Outside, somewhere farther down the block, a bottle rolled along the curb with a hollow glass sound. A couple argued in low voices on the opposite sidewalk, then kept walking without ever looking our way. Life went on. It always did. Even when yours had started splitting open at the seams. I slid the card into my coat pocket. You keep talking like this is now your problem. Tonight made it adjacent to my responsibilities. That is a very polished sentence for meddling. It is a very polite sentence for warning you. I looked at him for a long second, really looked this time. The expensive coat. The controlled posture. The impossible face made harder by exhaustion he was still pretending not to feel. And under all of it, something I could not quite name. Not guilt. Not obligation. Something sharper. Personal, maybe. As if my humiliation had offended a line inside him, he could not tolerate being crossed in his presence. Why did you not stop her sooner? The question left my mouth before I could decide whether I should ask it. Adrian went still in a way that told me I had finally reached a part of the conversation he had not rehearsed. I thought she would stop on her own, he said after a moment. I was wrong. It was the first plain admission of failure I had heard from him all night. No polish, no elegant wording, just wrong. For some reason, that hit me harder than the ring in the wine glass or the town car or the warning card in my pocket. Because perfection I knew how to resist. Humanity was harder. I do not need saving, I said, softer now, because that truth mattered enough to say carefully. Adrian's expression did not change, but his voice did. Just slightly. I know. Do you? Yes. He leaned back a fraction, eyes never leaving mine. You needed someone to say what happened to you was unacceptable while everyone else in that room was trying to price it. The words settled into the space between us and stayed there. I had no answer ready for them because nothing in my day-to-day life had prepared me for a man like Adrian Moretti seeing me that clearly and saying it out loud. My throat tightened in a way I did not appreciate. I reached for the door again before I embarrassed myself by showing him too much of that reaction. Good night, Mr. Moretti. His gaze dropped briefly to my hand on the door, then returned to my face. Good night, Chloe. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The air felt rougher after the warmth of the car. More real. I took 2 steps toward my building, then stopped when I heard the window behind me lower with a smooth electric hum. I turned back. Adrian sat half in shadow, one hand resting near the lowered glass. One more thing, he said. I should have kept walking. I knew that. Instead, I stood there under the weak yellow light of my building entrance with his card in my pocket and my pulse doing inconvenient things. What? Adrian's eyes held mine, dark and calm and impossible to misread now. If anyone comes to your door tomorrow asking questions about tonight, he said, do not let them in. Even if they say they were sent by me. I did not sleep. That was the first thing morning took from me. Not peace. Not certainty. Just sleep. I lay awake in my studio apartment listening to every ordinary sound turn suspicious in the dark. Pipes knocking inside the walls. Tires hissing over wet pavement below my window. The radiator clanking hard enough to make me flinch like it had bad intentions. At some point around 3 a.m, I gave up pretending rest was still possible and sat at my tiny kitchen table in an old sweatshirt with Adrian Moretti's card in front of me like it might explain itself if I stared long enough. Matte black. Silver lettering. No title. No company. Just his name and a number that felt far too direct for a man like him. I should have thrown it away. That is what a sensible person would have done. Instead, I turned it over in my hands until sunrise painted my apartment walls a tired gray and the city outside started making weekday noises again. Delivery trucks. Car horns. A dog barking somewhere downstairs because life, unlike dignity, Never waited for permission to move on. By 7:30, I was dressed for class in jeans, a navy sweater, and the coat I had bought 3 winters ago from a clearance rack in Queens. My tote bag was heavier than usual with textbooks and the extra anxiety of a woman trying to look normal after the least normal night of her life. I checked the peephole before opening my apartment door. Empty hallway. Peeling paint. Mrs. Alvarez's fake ivy plant drooping outside for B. Nothing dramatic. No mysterious men. No envelopes slid under the door. No one asking questions about Bellarosa. I almost laughed at myself then. Almost. Because standing there in the stale hallway light, I realized how ridiculous this all sounded in daylight. A wealthy fiancé. A public humiliation. A blacktown car. A man with eyes too calm for midnight telling me not to open my door to strangers, even if they used his name. It should have felt unreal by morning. Instead it felt sharper. Like daylight had stripped away the theater and left only structure underneath. I made it halfway down the block before I noticed the first thing wrong. My favorite coffee cart was closed. Not unusual by itself. The owner, Mr. Singh, sometimes opened late if his daughter had a school event or the espresso machine acted up. But a handwritten sign had been taped across the metal shutter in thick blue marker. Family emergency. Closed today. I slowed without meaning to, eyes catching on the words. Family emergency. Normal. Believable. Exactly the kind of phrase that could mean everything or nothing. I kept walking. At the corner, the crossing light changed and people surged around me in that efficient Manhattan wave that never fully stops for anyone. I turned east toward campus and tried not to think about whether the closed cart meant anything at all. By the time I reached the subway entrance, I had almost convinced myself I was spiraling over coincidence. Then my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. Unknown number. My heart gave one hard, unnecessary thud. I let it ring twice before answering. Hello. Silence first. Then a woman's voice, smooth and polished enough to qualify as expensive. Miss Bennett. I stopped on the top step of the subway entrance, cold morning air moving around me while commuters flowed past like I was a post in the river. Who is this? A friend offering advice. Every warning Adrian had given me the night before rose back into focus so fast, it almost made me dizzy. Job. Rent. School. The illusion that bad luck is random. I tightened my grip on the phone. I'm not interested. You should be. Women in your position often mistake attention for safety. My pulse kicked harder. I do not know what you are talking about. A soft laugh. Not kind. Of course you do. Last night was emotional. Unfortunate. Public scenes are so rarely flattering for the help. Something in me went still at that phrase. The help. As if I were not a person who had worked a double shift and paid her own bills and dragged herself through college one subway ride at a time. Just staff. Interchangeable. Disposable. Who is this? I asked again, quieter now. Someone telling you to be careful where you confuse a man's momentary attention with lasting protection. The line clicked dead before I could answer. I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear long enough for a man in a suit to brush my shoulder and mutter an annoyed excuse me on his way down the stairs. The city did not care that my morning had just split open. It never did. I lowered the phone slowly and looked at the screen. Private number. No trace. No name. Nothing to prove to anyone that the call had happened at all. For one reckless second, I thought about dialing Adrian's number right there on the sidewalk. Then pride rose up fast and sharp. I was not going to become the kind of woman who called a dangerous man because another dangerous woman had learned my phone number. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and went to class anyway. That was the stupid part. Or the brave part. Sometimes the difference is just whether things get worse. Mine did. By 10:15, I was sitting in the third row of macroeconomics trying to focus on a graph moving across the projector screen while my professor talked about market volatility in a voice so dry it could have preserved flowers. I had not written a single useful note. Every time my pen touched the paper, my mind replayed that polished voice on the phone. Attention. Safety. The help. At 10:23, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my landlord. I stared at the screen until the buzzing stopped, then started again immediately. Around me, students typed and coughed and opened laptops and lived entirely ordinary Tuesday mornings. I stepped out into the hallway before answering. Mr. Donnelly? Miss Bennett. His tone was clipped in a way I knew too well. I need to speak with you about your lease. The floor under me seemed to shift half an inch. What about it? There has been a complaint. I leaned against the cinder block wall and closed my eyes for 1 second. A complaint from who? That is not information I am at liberty to disclose. Of course it was not. What kind of complaint? He hesitated just long enough for dread to get organized. A concern regarding unauthorized commercial activity being conducted from the premises. I actually laughed once, short and disbelieving. What? I am not making accusations. I am informing you that a report was made, and I am required to follow up. I wait tables and go to school. I am not running a business out of apartment 4C. Then I suggest you make yourself available for inspection this evening. He hung up before I could answer. I stood there in the hallway outside room 302 with my phone in one hand and my pulse somewhere up near my throat. It had started. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Exactly the way Adrian said it would. One polite step at a time. By the time I walked back into class, I was no longer wondering whether last night had followed me into daylight. I was wondering how far it intended to go. By lunch my hands had stopped shaking, which would have been comforting if the rest of me had not felt like a wire pulled too tight. I made it through the rest of macroeconomics without hearing a single useful word, then sat through an ethics lecture that felt especially insulting given the state of my life. When class finally ended, the hallway outside filled with backpacks, winter coats, and the restless noise of students already moving on to the next thing. I stood by my locker with my phone in my hand, staring at Adrian Moretti's number the way a person might stare at a fire alarm, knowing exactly what it was for and still resenting the need for it. Pride is a strange thing when you are broke. People think poverty makes you easier to save. Sometimes it just makes dignity the only possession you guard with your whole body. Calling Adrian felt too close to surrender. It felt like admitting he had been right about everything, and worse, that he now belonged inside the structure of my life in a way I had not agreed to. So naturally, I called Lena first. She answered on the second ring, breathless over the sound of clinking silverware. Please tell me you are quitting college and opening a bakery in Vermont. Not today. Then I assume things are worse. I leaned against the row of metal lockers and lowered my voice. My landlord got a complaint this morning about unauthorized commercial activity in my apartment. There was a beat of silence, and in it I could hear the kitchen doors at Bellarosa swinging, the distant rush of lunch prep, and Lena's mind catching up to exactly how bad that sounded. That is not random, she said. I know. And the call. Private number. Woman's voice. Smooth enough to charge interest. She said women like me confuse attention with safety. Lena exhaled slowly. That sounds deliberate. Everything about today sounds deliberate. I slid down the locker half an inch until my shoulder took more of my weight. I do not want to do this. Meaning I do not want to call him and confirm that I am now exactly the kind of disaster he predicted. Chloe. Her voice softened, which was almost worse than panic. A disaster is when your car battery dies in February. This is a coordinated inconvenience campaign by a woman. With money and no shame. Use the number. I closed my eyes briefly. You make it sound so simple. It is not simple. It is necessary. I wish she were wrong. She almost never was. What if this is what he wants? I asked before I could stop myself. The question felt ugly the second it left my mouth. Not because it was unfair. Because some part of me was afraid it was not. Power always came with conditions. Men like Adrian did not move pieces on a board without understanding where they wanted them to land. Maybe he was warning me because he meant it. Maybe he was warning me because a frightened woman was easier to steer. Then you stay sharp, Lena said immediately. You accept help and keep your eyes open. Those two things are not opposites. I looked down the long hallway, bright with fluorescent lights and students who still believed their biggest problem was midterms. I hate this. That is because it is awful. Very helpful. I have many gifts. The corner of my mouth twitched despite everything. Lena heard it in my silence. Call him Chloe. She lowered her voice further. And for what it is worth, men who want control usually ask for gratitude first. So far, he keeps asking for caution. That landed harder than I wanted it to because it lined up with what I had already noticed and did not want to admit. Adrian never asked me to trust him. He never asked me to thank him. He never even pretended I owed him softness for stepping in at Bellarosa. He just kept telling me where the danger would come from and what shape it would take when it arrived. Which meant either he was unusually honest or dangerously strategic. Possibly both. I hung up with Lena and stood there another full minute, phone warm in my hand. Then I stepped into the stairwell, where the concrete walls swallowed some of the campus noise, and dialed the number on the card. He answered on the first ring. No greeting. No assistant. Just that low, steady voice, direct as a door opening. Tell me what happened. I gripped the phone tighter. How did you know it was me? Because you would not call unless something had already moved. My throat went dry for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. That is arrogant. Probably. No denial. No apology. Chloe. The way he said my name this time was different. Sharper. Focused. What happened? So I told him. The phone call. The landlord. The complaint. The inspection scheduled for that evening. Adrian did not interrupt once, which somehow made it easier to keep talking until I heard myself admitting the part one had not said out loud yet. You were right. Silence answered first. Not smug. Not triumphant. Just still. Yes, he said at last, and I would have hated that word from almost anyone else. From him, it sounded like confirmation, not victory. Listen carefully. Do not go back to your apartment alone. I straightened against the stairwell wall. Excuse me. You heard me. No. I heard you say something insane with the confidence of a man who expects to be obeyed. I expect you to be practical. I have class at 2 and work at 5. Your manager called your shift off an hour ago. I went very still. What? Kaplan received 3 cancellation requests from regular clients this morning. He is rearranging staff and pretending not to understand why. The air seemed to thin around me. How do you know that? Because I asked. You asked? Chloe. His tone changed, not louder, just firmer. You are spending energy on the wrong question. Vanessa is escalating in layers. Employment pressure. Housing pressure. Isolation next, if she can manage it. I need to know where you are. Need. Not want. Not prefer. Need. I hated that my pulse reacted to that word before my brain could sort out why. At school, I said after a beat. North Hall stairwell. Stay there. Do not tell me to stay there. Then consider it strong advice. I pushed away from the wall and started pacing the narrow landing, because standing still while Adrian Moretti reorganized my day through a cell phone was apparently beyond me. I am not a package you can reroute. No, he said. You are a woman someone is trying to pressure into becoming smaller. I am preventing that while there is still time to do it neatly. You keep saying things like that as if they are normal. They are normal in my world. That is exactly the problem. The line went quiet for half a second. Then Adrian said, more softly than before, I know. That stopped me. I pressed my free hand against the cool concrete railing and listened to the sounds of student life beyond the stairwell door. Laughter. Footsteps. A vending machine rattling somewhere down the hall. Ordinary things. The kind that made whatever was building around me feel almost impossible by comparison. What happens now? I asked. Now, Adrian said, you wait 5 minutes. Then you walk out the east entrance. A woman named Mara will be standing by a gray sedan. She works for me. She will take you somewhere safe until I can get there. Every instinct in me rose up at once. Absolutely not. Chloe. No. I am not leaving campus with a stranger because a man I met last night says she is safe. That is sensible. It is also why I sent a woman. The words hit with irritating precision. I closed my eyes. This is unbelievable. That does not make it less true. And where exactly is this safe place? Adrian's answer came without hesitation. My sister's apartment on the Upper West Side. I stopped pacing. You have a sister. Among other secrets. Under different circumstances, I might have laughed. Under these, all I could do was stand there in a campus stairwell with my life narrowing and widening at the same time. If I do this, I said carefully, it is not because you told me to. Of course not. It is because I need time to think. Then think somewhere harder to reach. I looked at the stairwell door, at the thin strip of fluorescent light beneath it, and realized with a clarity that felt almost cruel how fast my choices had changed. Yesterday, my biggest concern had been making rent and surviving a double shift. Today, a woman with a polished voice had my number, my landlord had a complaint, my boss had mysteriously lost my shift, and Adrian Moretti was sending his sister's driver to collect me like I had become a problem too visible to leave unattended. 5 minutes. I asked. 5 minutes, he said. Then, after the briefest pause, and Chloe? What now? His voice dropped lower. More personal. This is the last easy move she gets. 5 minutes can feel like nothing when you are waiting for a train, and like a lifetime when your life has just been reassigned by a man who sounds calm in emergencies. I stood in that stairwell listening to my own breathing and the muffled movement of students on the other side of the door, trying to decide when exactly my Tuesday had stopped belonging to me. Adrian had hung up without wasting a word, which somehow made his certainty feel even heavier. No promises, no reassurances, just a plan delivered in that low, steady voice like danger was a language he spoke fluently, and I was finally learning the grammar. At 4 minutes and 40 seconds, I pushed open the stairwell door and stepped back into the bright hallway. Nothing looked different. That was the unsettling part. 2 girls in Yankees caps were arguing over a group project by the vending machines. A boy with headphones too large for his head nearly ran into me because he was laughing at something on his phone. The campus smelled like coffee, old heat, and winter coats drying too slowly. Ordinary. Completely, painfully ordinary. I walked toward the east exit with my tote bag clutched too tightly against my side and every nerve in my body alert for something I could not name. When I stepped outside, the wind caught my hair and shoved it across my mouth. The gray sedan was parked exactly where Adrian said it would be. Clean. Quiet. Unremarkable in the way expensive competence often is. A woman leaned against the driver's side door with one hand in the pocket of a camel coat. She looked to be in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled into a low knot and sharp eyes that assessed without intruding. She did not wave. She did not smile too brightly. She just straightened when she saw me and said, "Chloe Bennett?" I stopped 6 feet away. Who was asking? A flicker of approval crossed her face. Mara Donnelly. I work with the Moretti family. She reached into her coat slowly and held out a phone instead of an ID. On the screen was a single text message from a number I recognized immediately, even though I had only seen it once on black cardstock. Go with Mara. I exhaled through my nose. He really does think of everything. No, Mara said, opening the rear passenger door. He thinks of the things that go wrong when other people assume they will not. That sounded close enough to Adrian that I believed her on the spot, which was probably not the best standard, but was, unfortunately, the one available to me. I got in. The ride to the Upper West Side took less than 20 minutes and felt longer than the entire previous night. Mara did not make awkward conversation. For that alone, I nearly liked her. She drove with the same controlled calm Adrian seemed to bring into every room, and I found myself wondering how long a person had to spend around men like him before stillness started to feel like its own kind of authority. Outside the window, Manhattan moved past in gray stone, scaffolding, delivery trucks, and people power walking through their own problems. I checked my phone twice. No new calls. No messages from my landlord. No update from Kaplan. The silence should have comforted me. Instead, it felt like the held breath before something louder. We pulled up in front of a limestone building with brass doors polished to a mirror shine and a doorman who took one look at Mara and stepped aside without question. Of course, power really did clear paths before it reached them. Upstairs, the apartment was warm, quiet, and so beautiful it almost offended me. Wide plank floors, cream walls, tall windows spilling pale winter light across bookshelves, and a navy velvet sofa that probably cost more than my semester tuition. Fresh flowers sat on the entry table in a white ceramic vase, and somewhere deeper inside, something smelled like tea and cedar. It did not feel like Adrian. That was the first thing I noticed. It felt softer, lived in, human in a way his car had not. You must be Chloe. I turned at the sound of the voice and saw a woman stepping out from the kitchen carrying 2 mugs. She was maybe a few years older than Adrian, with the same dark hair but warmer eyes, the kind that made you feel seen without feeling studied. She wore cream slacks, a blue cashmere sweater, and an expression balanced perfectly between concern and amusement. "I am Sophia," she said. "Adrian's sister. And before you ask, yes, he absolutely told me only half the story and expected me to work miracles with the rest." I stared at her for one startled second, then laughed. I could not help it. It slipped out of me like my body had found the first safe place to put the pressure. Sophia smiled and handed me one of the mugs. Chamomile. I could have cried. "Thank you," I said, wrapping my hands around the warmth. "You look like someone who has had a terrible 24 hours, she said. "That obvious?" "Only to women." Mara disappeared as quietly as she had arrived, leaving me standing in a gorgeous Upper West Side apartment with a mug of tea and the sister of the most dangerous man I had ever met. Sophia motioned toward the sofa. "Sit." Breathe. Nobody gets to you in here without going through me first, and I am in a very bad mood on your behalf. I sat because my knees suddenly seemed interested in honesty. The tea smelled faintly of honey and something floral I could not name. Across from me, Sophia settled into an armchair and tucked one leg beneath her with effortless elegance. Adrian says Vanessa started moving this morning, she said. No preamble, no pretending, just truth, plain and fast. I looked down at the steam rising from my mug. He was right. He usually is when trouble gets logistical. Her tone held no pride. If anything, it held fatigue. The kind that comes from loving someone competent enough to fix disasters and reckless enough to live near all of them. That does not make him easy to live with, she added. I glanced up. I had guessed. That earned a small smile. Then Sophia's eyes shifted past me toward the foyer, and something in her expression changed. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. I turned just as the front door opened. Adrian stepped inside, still wearing the same black coat from the night before, the city's cold clinging faintly to him, his gaze finding me before the door had even closed. He looked tired now. Truly tired. Not weaker. Just more real than he had allowed himself to appear in Bellarosa, or the car, or over the phone. His eyes moved once over the room, taking inventory, and then settled on the mug in my hands as if checking whether I had actually sat down long enough to be looked after. Sophia rose smoothly to her feet. I am going to make stronger tea, she announced, which was a very elegant way of leaving us alone. A second later, the kitchen swallowed her footsteps, and silence moved in behind them. Adrian took 2 steps into the living room and stopped. Not close enough to crowd me. Close enough to make it clear he had come straight here. Are you all right? He asked. The question should have been simple by now. It was not. Because something in his voice had changed. The steel was still there. The control. The impossible calm. But underneath, it was something rawer than before. Something that had slipped past discipline and was now standing in the room with us whether he wanted it to or not. I looked at the man who had warned me, moved me, and reached me before the day could close its hand fully around my throat. Then I asked the only question that mattered anymore. Adrian, I said quietly, what exactly did you end last night besides your engagement?